You know, in the middle of a war, you don't always get the hero you want. Sometimes you get the hero you need. And this is the story of a tank that was so ugly, so flawed, its own crews literally hated it. At least they did right up until the moment it saved their lives. So, picture this. It's 1940. You've got Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and his panzers just tearing across North Africa. They seem completely unstoppable. And one of the British get to try and stop this military genius? This thing. An ugly, awkward, and, let's be honest, seriously compromised tank that nobody, and I mean nobody, wanted. And you gotta understand, the situation for Britain was absolutely desperate. We're talking 1940, right after the disaster at Dunkirk. They'd left pretty much all of their tanks behind on the beaches of France. The country was basically defenseless, staring down a potential German invasion. They didn't just need tanks, they needed any tanks they could get their hands on, and they needed them yesterday. So, when the Americans sent over the plans for their new M3 tank, the British, well, they were horrified. They absolutely hated what they saw. For one, it was nearly 10 feet tall, a massive, easy target out in the open desert. And its main gun? It wasn't even in a proper turret. It was just sort of stuck on the side of the body. You could tell it was a total rush job, an emergency fix, and boy did it look the part. And that brings us to the elephant in the room, the tank's biggest, most glaring flaw. That sponson gun. Okay, so imagine a normal tank, right? The big gun is in a turret that can spin around 360 degrees. Not this one. The main 7.5mm cannon was basically bolted onto the side of the hull. This meant if you wanted to aim left or right more than a few degrees, the entire 28-ton tank had to turn. In a fast-paced tank battle, that's just a death sentence. It's like trying to fight with one arm tied behind your back. Okay, so the British were stuck with that main gun placement. There is no changing that. But they were like, all right, if we have to use this thing, we're making some changes. First, that big, tall American turret with its machine gun cupola, gone. They slapped on their own, much lower profile turret design, and here's a smart move. They moved the radio from the hull up into that new turret. Why? So the commander could actually talk to people while, commanding the tank. This British modded version became known as the Grant. The original American design kept the name Lee. All right, time for the showdown in the desert. The Grant is about to face its ultimate test, Erwin Rommel's legendary Africa Corps. With the design reluctantly signed off on, these weird, clunky machines were put on ships and sent straight to the one place where the war was all about speed and maneuver, North Africa. And waiting for them there was the undisputed master of that game, Erwin Rommel himself. And let me tell you, Rommel wasn't exactly sitting around waiting for them. He was on the move. He struck with lightning speed. March 24th, he attacks, ignoring orders from Berlin. By the 31st, he's broken through British lines. April 3rd, the key port of Benghazi falls. By the 7th, he's got the British surrounded at Mechili. The man was a whirlwind, an unstoppable force sweeping across the desert. So as Rommel's panzers are just blazing across Libya, what's happening back in Egypt? Well, the very first M3 Grants are being slowly unloaded off of ships. It's into this absolute chaos, this seemingly hopeless mess, that these tanks arrive. They're Britain's last throw of the dice. Just a handful of these unloved, untested machines arriving in the Army's absolute darkest hour. So could this compromised design really beat a military legend? I mean, just imagine being one of those crewmen. You look at your new tank, it's tall, it's awkward, that gun is in a ridiculous spot, and then you look at the map and you see Rommel's panzer is getting closer every single day. You'd have to be asking yourself, how on earth is this thing supposed to stop that? Well, the answer came on May 27, 1942, at the Battle of Gazala. This was it. This was the moment of truth. Because it turns out the Grant had a surprise up its sleeve, a 75mm surprise to be exact. It had one key advantage that nobody, especially not the Germans, was expecting. Yeah, 75mm. That was the secret. The American-made 75mm cannon. Okay, so yes, it was in a terrible spot. But the gun itself, it was powerful. It was high velocity. It could fire a nasty high-explosive shell just as easily as an armor-piercing one. But here's the crucial part, its range. It could reach out and touch someone from a long way off. The official war diary from the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment is so wonderfully British in its understatement. It just says, the enemy was definitely surprised to meet the new Grant tanks, which did some good work. Let me translate that for you. Surprised means the German panzer crews were absolutely stunned. They had no idea what was hitting them. And here's why that was such a huge deal. For the first time in the entire North Africa campaign, a British tank's main gun actually outranged its German counterparts. Up until this point, German panzers could just sit back and pick off British tanks from a safe distance. Now, suddenly the tables were completely turned. The Grants were landing hits before the panzers could even get close enough to fire back. It was a total game changer, a massive shock for the Afrika Korps, and you can bet it was a huge morale boost for the British crews. So the Grant proved its worth in battle. But its story is actually bigger than that. It was never designed to be the tank that won the war, not by a long shot. But its role was just as important. It really was history's perfect stopgap, the ugly duckling that played a decisive role. And you know what's funny? The very thing that made it a big target, that large, roomy hull, also made it super versatile. Take out the guns and boom, you've got a spacious command tank with plenty of room for maps and radios. Some were modified into these crazy scorpion mine-clearing tanks with a giant rotating drum of chains on the front to blow up mines. They even built a prototype to tow other broken-down tanks off the battlefield. The thing was a real jack-of-all-trades. And look, don't just take my word for how important this tank was. Listen to what General Bernard Montgomery had to say. The guy who eventually beat Rommel. In a letter to the American factory workers who built them, he said the Grants were a tower of strength during the days when the war went against us in Egypt. A tower of strength. Coming from him, that's some seriously high praise. But let's be real. Nobody ever thought the M3 was the final answer. It was always meant to be an interim design. Think of it like this. It was the finger in the dike, holding back the flood just long enough for the real cavalry to arrive. And that cavalry was the superior M4 Sherman tank, which was about to roll off the production lines in huge numbers. So, where does that leave us? Was the M3 Grant just an obsolete design, a clumsy mess that was a product of desperation? Or was it the absolute right tank at precisely the right time? The one thing that could show up with one critical advantage and change the game when everything seemed lost? Maybe the most fascinating thing about this ugly duckling of a tank is that it was both.